So, Keith, starting it off with you, if the question was, why was pro wrestling finally considered cool during the mid to late 90s after years of people just like making fun of it? Like you and I are wearing wrestling shirts right now. If you tried wearing a wrestling shirt in 94, 95, it's like, oh, you're a weird kid. But then towards the late 90s, it's like you had to wear Stone Cold, The Rock, NWO shirt for you. What made it finally cool?
I can distill it down into 4 words. Stone Cold Steve Austin. That is, I believe, everything that revolves around wrestling success at that time is because of Stone Cold Steve Austin. And I mean, you could argue the same thing for WCW and the NWO, but it's the attitude, pun intended, that came along with Stone Cold Steve Austin, because when you look at the 90s, the late 90s, the whole world was all about that attitude with your Jerry Springers and your South Parks and your Simpsons. Like, it was all like, authority, meh, 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 meh. And just being able to have this character on television that would drink beer and flip off his boss and beat the crap out of him. Like, Stone Cold was what wrestling needed to get ahead at that time. The character of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and just riding that wave, because whether you want to say like, oh, you can attribute it more to the NWO, which was the equivalent, a group equivalent that was happening on the other promotion, WCW, but the attitude and the aggression that was brought with it, that was wrestling in the 90s, the late 90s.
So, Ryan, in your case, you got into wrestling in 2001, right? It was around this
2000.
2000.
Late 2000. I remember Stone Cold was out on his injury when I started watching, and it was like right before he came back. But yeah, I think the NWO, this group that started in WCW having kind of this like FU attitude, and WCW started getting really popular, and that forced the WWF to make that change. And that was eventually how we got, Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock and everything from there. But very much it was a time where wrestling was able to match the culture of its time, where there was basically that FU attitude that was kind of the popular thing in the late 90s, that kind of movement, this like counterculture that it's like now today you just don't see as much, because the internet has just created like 50 million different little cultures.
It's a cesspool
that you can never capture and appeal to like a large group anymore, because there's just so many small segments. But at that time, wrestling was able to really strike into a lot of people's imaginations, and just create this huge movement of wrestling fans that just were passionate. You had D-Generation X as well, and it was all clicking. They were banging on all cylinders, and just right place at the right time, and everything worked out, and wrestling exploded. And it's hard to think that they'll ever get there again, because it's like I said, the world is just such a different place now.
It was really the infancy of reality television. That's what wrestling was pulling off during that time, because you had these larger than life characters that were based more in reality now, because you didn't have your Hulk Hogan's, the traditional Hulk Hogan of, let me tell you something, brother, say your prayers and eat your vitamins, and I'm gonna slam Andre the Giant 750 pounds in front of 55 million people in the Thunderdome, brother. You had more of your Mr. Asses, where I don't know why that's the only example I could come up with.
When I think of attitude,
of all your relatable examples,
I had to choose Billy Gunn, Mr. Ass, because it's not this like over the top character anymore. It's not this larger than life earthquake. It's just Billy Gunn and the Road
His
Dogg
ass.
and X-Pac, just these guys that are just cool guys, not characters, characters, but not characters, kind of like reality television, and they were just like cool dudes that you wanted to watch on TV.
Yeah, and even someone as famous as The Undertaker for having this dead man gimmick changed, like adapted with the times,
He
and
became
made
cool.
himself.
He became cool.
Yeah, he made himself a more realistic character.
He came back to life and decided to be a biker.
Yes, recognizing that maybe this wasn't the right time to be that character.
And you got to look at something like the Hardy Boys, right? The Hardy Boys, I think everybody thinks about the tables, ladders, and chairs matches, which in our WrestleMania 17 review, we'll be talking about that. But you look at these people, it's like, what were the Dudley Boys? Two dudes, like two guys that just love to beat up people. Jeff and Matt Hardy, like they were just dude in pants and like, tight t-shirts. Like Edge and Christian, same thing. I think it's interesting because when you look at wrestling a couple of years before, we mentioned like, what do you have? Like your Gobbledygooker, your the Goon, all these characters that just make you cringe and they are below what society deems acceptable. But then as the Attitude Era came in and wrestling became popular, it's like, hey, I can totally envision myself being Stone Cold Steve Austin. I can totally envision being Hulk Hogan around this time where people love me and then they started booing me. So I'm going to turn on you. I'm going to take over the whole show. And I think it's all of these dreams that many people have had in their heads for years. And we actually got to see it. And Ryan, you made a great point that I don't think wrestling can ever match that because I think social media has taken over that feeling, right? It's like I can follow you on social media now, and maybe you're living the life that I want to live. I mean, I don't know if that's true, Ryan, although you do have your pug, and your pug is amazing, and I don't have a pug. So I guess it's kind of similar, right?
Yeah, social media, I mean, it can be unhealthy because it creates envy, and that can lead to a bad thing. But to kind of piggyback off of the original point of there's so many different communities now, because you can even look at like a television show like Game of Thrones, you might be able to say was like the last like event television that may ever exist, where there's just so many people that are ready to watch one show live. That, I mean, have we seen a show like that since? I would say no. Maybe like The Mandalorian is maybe like the closest thing that I've seen, but even then it's like that's still like mostly people, Star Wars fans, which I know is a big community, but still, like, you got to be, I feel like, a certain level of Star Wars fan to be really dedicated to watching that, as they show it weekly. So yeah, event television has kind of come and gone, and aside from like the Super Bowl once a year, you just really don't see it anymore.
I kind of disagree with that because it's not that it's gone, it's just hasn't come back, if that makes sense. Like, there's always going to be something that breaks through. It just hasn't happened in a while.
It'll always be there to a degree, but it will never reach the same volume of people aside from basically the Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And I mean, it only happens like once in a generation, right? Like, it's weird to think about it, but the only other thing really in our lifetime, or I guess there's two things that I would put on the level of Game of Thrones, are like Seinfeld and Friends. Like, those are the must-watch, sit there every week and check it out and sit in front of the TV.
Breaking Bad, sort of there, but I think it got more popular after the fact, almost, when people could go back and watch it.
I wouldn't put it on that level. And just think about the time between Friends and Game of Thrones. I imagine there will be another one again.
And I think there's a lot. The problem is that in going back to our discussion here with wrestling, back then, because it's like, yeah, you could record things on a VCR, right? Like that was something. But with wrestling, for example, you wanted to watch Monday Night Raw live during the 90s to see what Stone Cold would do next. You wanted to watch WCW Monday Nitro to figure out what was going to happen. Even with Game of Thrones was a series that was still like, when that was watched, like, I didn't watch it, but my wife did, right? It was still like on the HBO, like there was the HBO app, but it was still like, hey, you got to tune on HBO when that happens. You look at something now like a One Division, which came out every Friday. It comes out Friday, but Keith can watch it in 2 a.m. I can watch it in the afternoon. Ryan can watch it at night. And that creates like a disconnect because we're watching it on the same day, hypothetically, but it's not the same experience that, like, I know Ryan is watching it at the same time that I'm watching it now. And I think that essence of like the necessity of, I gotta sit down and check this out now, is maybe why wrestling was so damn popular in the 90s. But once everything else became that, it's kind of like, oh, I mean, I could watch The Ass Man, or I can watch these 30 shows that have been able to give me that same essence in different ways.
Yeah, it was just an amalgamation of everything that was cool in the 90s, right? Because you had rock music still existed in the late 90s, RIP rock music. But I mean, even though like it's kind of cringy to look back at like Limp Bizkit and things like that, but that was the music that was popular, and that was the music, that was the type of music, literally Limp Bizkit, you were hearing in wrestling. Then you had shows, we talked about Jerry Springer. There was a ton of other shows like Maury and stuff that were big at that time. And the ridiculous storylines in wrestling were really just an extension of those types of shows. The drama between like she's sleeping with who or whatever.
That would actually be like a fun episode sometime of like, I lay out a scenario and you have to tell me if it was Attitude Era or Jerry Springer.
Oh, that would be difficult. That would be difficult.
Pretty much. We're too big a wrestling nerds though. Like, I feel like we're too big. We need to ask someone who's not as familiar with wrestling. Yeah. And that could actually be really
Anybody
funny.
that's watching and listening now, a person giving birth to a hand, an episode of Jerry Springer, or wrestling. It's like, just leave that to your imagination. An old lady getting powerbombed through a table. I mean, I feel like that could be
that's got to be Jerry Springer.
Yeah,
exactly.
That always happens on the Jerry Springer.
Exactly. So we've talked about the context of like why wrestling became popular as a whole, like not just the Attitude Era, but just like wrestling as a whole. Because even like, ECW, all that good stuff, that was, let's say, like 97, 99. You could even stretch it out till the year 2000. But much like anything else, like once people become used to something, you can only be the must-watch show every single Monday night. And then many things started happening, especially in 2001. I mean, 2001, like not joking, people, was maybe one of the roughest years because you have something like 9/11 that happened in September, and that directly impacted stuff like from like movies having to be delayed because like, hey, it's New York, and every movie has at least like one scene of New York or something. Video games needed changing. Wrestling had to adapt because obviously a lot of things happened. And in the context of wrestling and the Attitude Era, WCW and ECW were gone. The last ECW pay-per-view was Guilty as Charged at the very beginning of the year. And then in March, we had the Night of Champions television show, which was the last broadcasted episode of Nitro. So by WrestleMania, if you didn't like the WWF, that was it. Like, you're out of luck. Like, it wouldn't be till years later where things like Ring of Honor and all of that through tape trading would be more available than, things were during the 90s. So considering this card that has things like Kurt Angle versus Chris Benoit, Kane, Raven, Big Show, TLC 2, The Gimmick Battle Royale, Undertaker, Triple H, Stone Cold Steve Austin versus The Rock, and you have the things that concluded at the beginning of the year, would you say, starting with Ryan, that the Attitude Era did conclude in many ways with WrestleMania 17?
I believe it absolutely did. I think WrestleMania 17 was the perfect endpoint for the Attitude Era, and pretty much after this event, we really did see wrestling completely change as we knew it. It just encapsulated, I think, everything great about the Attitude Era. Of course, you have the great tag team divisions with TLC between the three most popular Attitude Era tag teams, Edge and Christian, Dudley Boys, Hardy Boys. Then you have like Shane McMahon versus Vince McMahon, which really encapsulates the really ridiculous, absurd storylines that you would see in the Attitude Era. And that was just a great way to wrap that up, having the entire McMahon family, which really is where they came up as these prominent figures, was completely in the Attitude Era. So that was like another encapsulation. And then you have the two biggest Attitude Era figures going head to head with Stone Cold and The Rock. And then sprinkled in, you have stuff like the Hardcore Championship and the European Championship. But it all, like, very much we saw a lot of that change immediately after. All these other championships were introduced and then consolidated. It was the last time we really saw that structure for a long time, even with the structure of like Raw and SmackDown, where Monday Night Raw would happen and then SmackDown would almost be like a continuation to whatever was happening on Monday Night Raw. And a lot of that changed very quickly following this. So everything we seem to know about the Attitude Era really did come to an end, especially with, of course, the purchase of ECW and WCW. And we saw WCW making a much bigger impact in the show after WrestleMania 17. So it absolutely was the conclusion in my eyes.
Mm-hmm. It's never been like officially said, but the way that like the wrestling year in the WWF works is that WrestleMania is almost like the season finale, where everything kind of starts to build the night after WrestleMania towards the next one. And if you think about that period in wrestling of March, early April 2000 to end of March 2001, like at that point, WCW and ECW were still prominent, but we were on the downward slope at that point. The best days of WCW were behind them, and they really just, the things that WCW gets made fun of, that's the time that was happening. Your Viagra on a poles and Judy Bagwell's on poles matches, all of that was during that season. It was on the downward slope, and ECW, while still a good product, was on a different downward slope in a financial way, where just the money wasn't happening and they were on a crash course to hitting a wall financially and claiming bankruptcy, which is inevitably what happened about partway through that season, in quotes, of the WWF. So by the time we got to the end of the season, which was WrestleMania 17, well, now all the competition is owned and bought by the WWF. So now you don't really have that incentive to keep firing on all cylinders anymore, because now you are your own competition, just unofficially at this point, because this was like before the brand split was. So that's why, like, I think that's the essence of why the Attitude Era ended there, because A, it was the natural conclusion as far as the way that the WWF tells stories, and B, that's the point where the competition truly died.
And it's worth pointing out, whether you like wrestling or not, people just didn't like wrestling on TV at this point. Like, there's an excellent book for WCW that I'm reading right now, and they talk specifically about, and there's been many podcasts that say, look, television executive producers saw wrestling always as like lesser than. And by the time that all these shows that we've talked about, throughout the course of the podcast, movies, wrestling in the early 2000s was just not cool. People had their time, right? It's like, oh, we had DX, we had NWO, cool. Can we please move on to something else? Plus, a lot of people are getting older. WCW were in the situation that under new ownership with changes in TV, it's like they were getting cut and censored and changed up until eventually WCW was sold for almost next to nothing to the WWF. And then in ECW's case, Extreme Championship Wrestling, the name is Extreme, right? They were so extreme that also led to many problems with people just don't want their product on TV. Even you look at the tail end of ECW, and Paul Heyman, the former owner, said, look, we were adapting. Like, ECW was not that extreme towards its end because they knew, hey, in order to survive, I got to clean my stuff up. So it's kind of interesting that, we've said throughout this episode that wrestling was catching up to like our real life problems. But in doing so, WCW, ECW, and WWF kind of had to like be very normal so they could be advertiser friendly. So a family would feel comfortable in watching, because it's like, hey, I can't be the only person that whenever a certain match was happening, bra and panties, that's when your mom happens to walk in. It's like, oh, no.
Yeah.
I'm watching
Every
wrestling.
Time.
Exactly. I remember, I think it was like in 2001, 2002, I fly out to Chicago with my family, and then it's like, a lot of hardcore matches. But when does my uncle walk in? When Stacy Keibler is dancing, and I'm like, okay, I I got nothing. I got nothing. It was just the worst.
It was just like when I used to play SmackDown 2 on PlayStation 1. It's like every time the Trish Stratus loading screen came up was when my mom walked in. And you're just like, come on, there's so many other ones. But there was like a weird different phenomenon that anytime my sister came in while I was watching wrestling, Rikishi was always on screen. I don't know how it was. It was, she just always saw Rikishi.
The big quiche was magnetic. Yep, just pulled that. It's got its own gravitational orbit, so she was just pulled right in there.
She was pulled into orbit.
So the whole concept of like the Attitude Era really was the competition between companies. With WWF buying them out, they literally became their own competition. So as wrestling fans, starting with Keith, it's like when you found out, even in this WrestleMania, it's kind of weird and crazy to think about. Like they referenced WCW here. And WrestleMania 17 is considered to be one of the best WrestleManias of all time. Yet it's weird that you're seeing the beginning of the new chapter here. How did you feel knowing that eventually you're going to see some not so familiar faces on the show that you grew up watching?
Well, like every wrestling fan, just thinking about in this bubble of watching WrestleMania 17 and not knowing what happened afterwards, I was really excited. Having watched WCW and then later ECW, them kind of going towards that invasion angle was really exciting. What ended up happening happened, but the concept of seeing the biggest stars from WCW, your Hulk Hogan's, your Stings, your Goldbergs, all coming, your Diamond Dallas Pages, all coming to the WWF and wrestling against the biggest stars from that company, it was awesome. I was so excited for the invasion, but then we got Shawn Stasiak instead, and it just didn't do it for me.
We did. Ryan, in your case, obviously your context is very different because this is basically when you started consuming it. What did you think about this whole concept that like, hey, yeah, we are basically combining shows in many ways?
Yeah, so when I got into wrestling, like I said, in 2000, WCW was already basically considered just complete crap. So it wasn't really anything I even, I flipped to it like one time for about 5 seconds before I flipped back to Raw. So coming in as a person who had no knowledge of WCW wrestlers aside from knowing Hulk Hogan was there, and I recognized Sting's face basically just because of like stuff you'd see in stores and in Goldberg. But when the invasion actually happened, it's like these were people I didn't really care about because I just didn't know who they were. Eventually when I became more of a wrestling nerd, you start to do your homework and learn more about everybody. And obviously like people like Rob Van Dam were really fun to watch. So eventually you just grow to like them based on what you saw in their work in the WWF and WWE. So it's really like it took a while for me to start liking a lot of these new faces.
And I think that's always been one of the weirdest things because I grew up watching WCW. So for me, it's like, oh, I gotta make the change, right? I'm the one making the switch to watch the other show, and then I'm the one watching the WCW guys get destroyed by the WWF. And the problem, like as a fan, I was under severe depression around this point, like being perfectly honest. And it was a rough time because wrestling was my escape. Yet I'm watching these characters that I loved, and DDP became a stalker shortly after this. And I'm like,
oh, yeah, right. I forgot about that.
How that is.
Gee, I wonder why all those mysterious WCW fans that never came back.
Exactly. It's like WWF basically told you, look, if you're a fan of ECW, you got your Rob Van Dam. Like he made the transition, but everybody else, it's like screw off. Essentially,
the difference was that WWF poached most of the ECW talent at that point. The biggest stars in ECW, your Taz's, your Dudley Boys, with the exception of Rob Van Dam, were already with the company. So you're not just going to poo-poo on these stars you've already built. With WCW, all of these people were coming in fresh, and they're like, well, you are less than what we have. Why do we need a Chavo Guerrero when we already have an X-Pac? suck and just made them significantly less. And then the guys that did come over from the WCW beforehand, your radicals being Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Saturn, and Chris Benoit, they weren't seen as WCW guys. They were WWF guys at that point. So you were really just setting WCW up to fail as much as possible at that point.
Hey, thanks for checking out the video. If you liked it, please consider subscribing, and we are also available on podcast feeds, so search the name, click on the Sword and Stone, and enjoy a brand new episode every single Sunday.